Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion today, focusing on the African Continental Free Trade Area as an enabler of building green resilient industries. My name is Maria from the African Climate Foundation, and just briefly, as a foundation, we support initiatives that address climate change on the continent, but also unlock new avenues of development. So essentially working at the nexus of climate change and development, which happens to be the core of our discussion today. We commissioned a series of expert briefs as part of scoping work undertaken within our energy access and transitions program. And the briefs broadly speak to or focus on specialized topics on the political economy of Africa's power sector transformation and opportunities and challenges for scaling renewable-based electrification. And the conversation today will focus on one of the five topics covered in the set of briefs and also contribute to a broader discussion around how the ambition of the AfCFTA could be raised or could be an opportunity to support climate change objectives on the one hand and support continental industrialization on the other. And at the same time, there are a number of trade-related challenges, financing bottlenecks, and systemic issues that need to be addressed globally in order to create the right conditions to maximize on some of these opportunities. So we are extremely honored to have two speakers today, both of whom are engaged in this area and also serve on the AfCFTA Trade and Industrial Development Advisory Council that was inaugurated earlier this year. And our first speaker today is Dr. Rob Davies, who is an honorary professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He serves on the Advisory Council on Trade and Industrial Development, appointed by the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. In 2019, he retired after 25 years of service as a member of parliament, and between 2009 and 2019 served as South Africa's Minister of Trade and Industry. He holds an honors degree in economics, a master of social science and international politics, and a PhD in political studies. And our second speaker today is Professor Faizel Ismail, who is the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, also at the University of Cape Town. He has a PhD in politics from the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom, an MPhil in development studies from the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, and BA and LLB degrees from the University of KwaZulu-Natal here in South Africa. And he served as the Ambassador Permanent Representative of South Africa to the World Trade Organization between 2010 and 2014, and was also South Africa's Special Envoy on the South Africa-USA AGOA negotiations between January 2015 and June 2016. He's the author of 3 books on the WTO, and in 2021 published a book on the AfCFTA and developmental regionalism. So thank you both for joining this conversation today. Rob Davies will start us off with a presentation drawing on the ACS research brief, after which I will give the floor to Prof. Faizel, who will give a few comments and share some insights from a draft paper on trade and climate resilient development in Africa. To our participants, please do post questions and comments in the Q&A box during the presentations, and I will make sure to pick them up during our discussion. So Rob, over to you. Rob, you're on mute.
Sorry, I said, well, thank you very much, Maria, and good afternoon to everyone who's participating. So I trust that my slides will be put up. So the title of the presentation today is exactly the same as the title of the paper that Maria mentioned. So the next slide, please. And the aim of the paper is to really call for a greater synthesis between the projects and programs that are seeking to promote renewable energy on the African continent and projects and proposals that are aiming to build regional value chains within the continental free trade area. So it's a synthesis that I'm really calling for, and around the issues of building a green industries value chain. And I make the point that the Advisory Council and the Secretariat have already agreed in principle on the desirability of building a green industries value chain within the African continental free trade area. And in addition to the issues that I raised in the paper, I'm also going to raise a couple of trade policy issues and other related challenges that are lying ahead, particularly as we move towards COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh. I'm going to relate those to the issues that I discussed in the paper. Next slide, please. So I think the first thing is, and it's probably very familiar to everyone who's involved in the issues of climate, is that the world economy is in the midst of an accelerated transition to a lower carbon economy. And I think that transition is likely to gather pace. I'm saying a transition to a lower carbon world economy, not that we are solving the problems of climate change, but that related to the threats of catastrophic climate change, measures are being taken that will accelerate the transition to a lower carbon world economy. Now, the reasons for this acceleration are well known. We are in a world where the scientific consensus is that human-induced global warming has reached the point where business as usual will lead to catastrophic climate change. The Secretary General of the United Nations before COP26 talked about code red for the planet. I think that what it is, it's the industrial activity and the use of carbons, particularly in the period after 1945, but also before that, has led to huge amounts of emissions of greenhouse gases, which, according to the default scenario of the International Panel on Climate Change, the scientific body, they predict that if we just leave everything as it is, business as usual, there'll be a rise in average global temperature of 4.4 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And I think it's worth mentioning that well, that's the average global rise. Africa warms by more than that, more than the world average. And actually, the IPCC has got a chapter or paper that talks about what are the particular risks, climate risks for each of the different regions on the African continent. They vary, but they are desertification or storms and the effects of rising sea levels in coastal regions. Now, of course, if we had a scenario like that, large parts of the planet would be uninhabitable. People say that life on Earth would probably survive a transition like that, but human civilization may well not. It immediately result in hundreds of millions, if not billions, of climate refugees. And actually, there already are climate refugees on the African continent. Not all of them are crossing borders, but the massive urbanization which is occurring across the continent, as well as across the developing world in general, is partly the result of climate change, which is making rural economies less and less viable. But even if we have more optimistic scenarios, if we were to achieve the targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees, what we're going to see is a continued proliferation of extreme weather events from the global warming that's already locked in. So even if we do take action that is going to reduce the threat of catastrophic climate change to a level of still serious climate change, there's going to be a proliferation of extreme weather events. I just mentioned, I think it's worth noting that there was a redacted section of the IPCC report, which was now leaked, and particularly monthly review publication has been publicizing this, and it doubts that we will actually be able to achieve 1.5 to 2 degrees just by supply side measures by green technologies. It actually says there will be a need for a 40% decline in overall global energy consumption. So I think that's just to put that in there as well. Next slide, please. So I'm really saying that I don't think that we can conclude that the decisions of the COPs have averted the threat of catastrophic climate change. That threat is still with us. But definitely those decisions are heralding an acceleration of a global transition to a lower carbon economy. And I'm giving some examples of this, that the decision at COP26 to phase down coal even if it was a watering down of the phase out of coal, and even if contradicted by the fact that there was nothing similar in relation to the other fossil fuel oil, is likely to accelerate the decommissioning of coal-based energy plants across the world and to decrease the global demand for coal. Then on top of that, there are, next slide please, the net zero commitments by developed countries. They're leading to pressures on trading partners to show that the products that they are exporting into those developed country markets are produced through lower carbon processes, including lower carbon electricity generation. And then there are specific measures which are being discussed, and I discuss that a bit later in more detail, but carbon border adjustment mechanisms. They used to be known as border adjustment taxes. Now they're trying to soften it, but carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These are basically, they will measure your carbon used in your production, and if it is over a limit, it's going to affect their net zero commitments, then they will put in place some kind of an adjustment mechanism, which is actually a tax. And I'm saying this is public standards. And then there's the action of private buyers supported by developed country governments, who are all going to be encouraged to, buy closer at home, use less carbon in transport, all sorts of things like that, private standards. These will all lead to more pressures to measure and cut carbon inputs. So I think we're saying that developing countries, I'm arguing, are likely to be affected beyond the common but differentiated commitments that we've all agreed to as individual countries. Next slide, please. Then this is taking place in a world of widening inequality. I'm saying that the world economy is still not fully recovered from the COVID crisis. And in particular, I think if you look at a country like South Africa, they say the GDP and GDP growth is back to where it was before the pandemic, but unemployment, poverty, and inequality are definitely not. Vaccine apartheid that we saw during the pandemic was followed by what UNCTAD has called recovery separate development. Developed countries spend between 20 and 25% of their GDPs on recovery programs, while many of the poorest countries spend less than 1% of much smaller GDPs. And they continue to be affected by austerity and debt service commitments, which are only slightly and temporarily relaxed during the pandemic. And this, as we all know, has been followed by stagflation. We're back to the 70s, depressed growth coexisting with rising energy and food prices, partly caused by disruption of supply chains during and around the pandemic, but also partly by the war in Ukraine. Next slide, please. So I'm saying that in such a context, in a context of a world of widening inequality, inequality between developed and developing countries as well as within countries, there's a huge potential for a transition to a lower carbon economy to be driven by much that's unfair. There will be losers as well as winners. And in many countries, the decommissioning of high carbon activities without purposeful and effective intervention and without resource transfers could lead to there being more losers than winners. There's no guarantee that those individuals and communities that are most affected will be those that are best equipped to benefit from new green jobs. And so I'm saying that there's an imperative for a just transition and to recognize that the default scenario for much of the developing world is actually an unjust transition. Next slide, please. I'm saying, and I think this comes to the point that Faizel might want to take up, but that I'm saying that the issue of a just transition, if we want to use that language and the call for a just transition, has got to address issues of structural transformation as well. It can't just be that there will be resources and programs that in national countries at national level. There's also got to be a recognition that the underdeveloped world, including Africa, has a right to development, and that this should be supported as part of the move to a more inclusive world order. And I'm suggesting that underdevelopment is fundamentally the result of the insertion of the developing world, as it's called, into the global division of labor as producers and exporters of primary products, mineral or agricultural raw materials, which are used in value-added production elsewhere. And that this reality dates back to colonialism and slavery, and also that remaining a producer and exporter of primary products is actually the least lucrative place to occupy in global value chains, and is becoming more and more the least lucrative place to be in the era of knowledge-intensive products. So, for example, the iPhone 6, which is a pretty old iPhone these days, which retailed for about $600 in the US, only $1 of that $600 was the price of the raw materials incorporated in it. So being in a mere producer and exporter of raw materials is at the root of underdevelopment. And also those few countries that have moved from underdeveloped to developed, from poor to rich, have diversified and moved to higher value added production. In other words, they have industrialized. So next slide, please. So the transition to the lower carbon economy is leading to the emergence of new green technologies and to a wave of what's called green industrialization. And I think the key question, which I'll come to in various ways as we move on, is will the developing world, including Africa, be able to share in the opportunities created by green industrialization, or will we once again be relegated to a role of only consumers of products of green industrialization produced elsewhere, buttressed also by unfair trading practices? I think that's the key question. Next slide, please. And I'm saying all this is compounded by the imperative to build more resilience against both future health and extreme weather emergencies. And I think there's a link between the two, that the diseases that we're behind, that we are confronting and we're behind COVID, are zoonotic in nature, and they're also due to the intrusion, destructive intrusion on habitats of animal species, bringing the animal and human animals and human contact much closer, and leading to the spread of diseases from animals to humans. So I'm saying COVID-19 is not the first cross-border epidemic. It will not be the last. That pandemic showed massive underpreparedness of the healthcare systems across the world. And it also showed a vulnerability created by dependence on imported supplies, as well as that caused by overcrowded housing, inadequate water and sewage. Next slide, please. And I'm taking those lessons into the issue of climate change, and saying, even if, which is a very, very big if, the political will is found to take the steps necessary to avoid catastrophic climate change. As we said earlier, science tells us to expect more extreme weather events. So I'm saying 2020 and 2016 were the hottest single years on records. The 5 years to 2021 were the highest 5-year period on records. And there were record numbers of floods, fires, drought, locust invasions, and the threat all over the world during those years, with the threat of rising sea levels looming. So I think there's an objective need to build more resilient infrastructure and to climate-proof existing infrastructure. And with adequate resources behind a program of this, it could boost employment. Next slide, please. Just to conclude that point, what I'm saying is that I think the lessons from the COVID are that if we don't do this proactively, we'll have to deal with it after the events, when people have lost homes, where people have been killed, and where people's livelihoods have been affected. We either do it proactively or we face the crisis afterwards. And if we are expecting to rely on imported components, we may find supply lines unreliable as they were for vaccines during COVID. So now I'm coming to, and I looked at the literature and tried to say, well, what are people saying are the potential gains for Africa from a transition to a lower carbon economy? So first of all, there's quite a lot of papers which are arguing that the rollout of renewable energy, particularly as it becomes cheaper, could contribute to closing the energy gap between those without energy and those who have access to energy. And they point out that 60% of the households without access to energy are actually in Africa. Or no, not access to any energy, but access to adequate energy only in Africa. 20% of Africa's current power generation is renewable. 67% of this is from hydropower. And I want to make a point about hydropower because I think it's one of the areas where Africa is potentially highly competitive. That 67% of renewables from hydropower is actually down from 75% as it was earlier, as other forms of renewable energy have been introduced. But while many pushing for what, some of the literature I've seen, they call for, make a distinction between hydropower and what they call modern forms of renewable energy, wind, solar, biomass. But I want to say that while many are pushing for so-called modern forms, I'm arguing that Africa's competitive advantage in hydropower and potentially also in hydrogen fuel cell technology, using platinum, which a number of countries on the continent have, as a catalyst, these competitive advantages need also to be realized. One other advantage that's been mentioned of going renewable is that renewable forms could be off-grid. That includes hydrogen fuel cells, which could provide power to distant communities. And some work in South Africa some years ago said that if you were more than 30 kilometers from the grid, it was actually probably cheaper to use the hydrogen fuel cell to power sort of public infrastructure, community centers, clinics, schools, than to connect to the grid. So the renewable forms have a potential to be off-grid, and they could enhance access to more remote communities. Next slide, please. So another point that's been mentioned in the advantages to Africa, the potential gains, are that the global transition to a lower carbon economy will increase the demand for minerals that Africa already mines or could do so, including cobalt, lithium, graphite, chromite, manganese, platinum. The World Bank says 3 billion tons of such minerals will be needed, to realize, they say, the objectives of 2%. But I pointed out that there's the IPCC said that simply moving to renewable energies using new technologies alone is not going to bring us into the safer zones. But what I'm arguing, though, really here in the paper is that while it's important to realize these opportunities, such as they are, the real prize really will be whether this transition to the lower carbon economy can contribute to the long-standing objective to overcome underdevelopment by moving to high value-added production, i.e. Industrializing. So I then go in, and this will be very familiar to Faizel and others in the area of the continental free trade area, but regional integration has long been seen as a critical enabler of African development. And in fact, the division of the continent into 54 countries and the small economies that each individual state is in charge of has been long seen since the earliest days of independence as a barrier to the continent's development, and hence regional integration has been seen as a key objective. Now, I'm making the point that the Continental Free Trade Area is the most ambitious regional integration project which has been undertaken on the African continent. It was influenced by several paradigms, but I think that what is important and what the Advisory Council and others are trying to promote is that the development integration or developmental regionalism paradigm is prominent among those. And this argues that really, if we are to achieve a shift towards a strong and dynamic continental integrated market, the issues at stake are not just questions of tariffs and trade. They're also questions of actually building institutions and value chains, because the biggest barriers to interregional trade are actually often not that there are tariffs in place, but it is that the countries, the neighboring countries, do not produce the goods that each other needs. They're not complementary. One country produces a mineral product which it exports outside of the continent for the rest of the world. The other one produces maybe even the same, but even if it's a different one, there's not much trade that can take place between the two of them because their production structures are not complementary. And on top of that, the infrastructure which historically was built on the continent was mostly to service the export of primary products outside of the continent. Roads, rails, and ports are all geared to that, and not to promoting intra-regional trade on the continent. So next slide, please. So then these are the what Faizel has identified in one of his works as the critical elements of this. We need asymmetrical trade integration. We need a trade integration arrangement. In other words, we need to have a trade arrangement that recognizes and caters for the uneven development of the countries of the continent. This needs to be aiming to promote the free trade area, structural transformation and transformative industrialization, including through the creation of regional value chains to build a robust regional market and unlock the continent's manufacturing potential. There needs to be cooperation on cross-border infrastructure investment, as well as trade facilitation and cooperation to promote democracy, good governance, peace and security. Trade facilitation, matters of customs administration, and all of the processes necessary to get a product across borders. Next slide, please. So I'm saying that developmental regionalism would look to regional integration to achieve more than a quantitative increase in intra-regional trade. You know, we obviously are looking, so next slide, please, sorry. We are looking, of course, to see that the continental free trade area will increase inter-regional trade, but we're actually looking for a qualitative shift in its character. And that would see the real prize of the continental free trade areas being that it facilitates the emergence of regional value chains that could support a move to higher value added production. You see, the size of the combined continental free trade area market is such that it could potentially support significant diversification and deeper industrialization, much more than could happen in individual countries, much more even than could happen at the level of regional economic communities. And if this unfolded through a multifaceted development integration approach, it would see a change in the quality and composition of intra-regional trade, as well as an increase in its volume. If we saw regional value chains, we'd see more trade in intermediate products and components, as more products are produced with inputs from several countries and consumed in multiple countries on the continent, as well as exported. And actually, it's well worth noting that the fastest and largest component of global trade is, in fact, trade in intermediate components and products. At the moment, we sell raw materials and we import finished goods. We're not much in this space. And if we had regional value chains with a developmental integration approach, we would expect to see more of that. Now, I do talk in the paper because the argument is about moving towards green regional value chains. It is about, sorry, the next slide is what is a value chain? So the value chain refers to the full range of activities needed to create a product or service, everything from the conception of a product to its final distribution. And you know, it's the manufacturing, it's the all the services that go with it, it's all of the different raw materials that have to be amassed, all of the processing required to get a good to its final distribution. Now, cross-border global value chains have been much talked about and are particularly associated with what Manuel Castells talked about in his famous trilogy in the 1990s about the transition to the digital economy. He called it globally networked capitalism. And that you saw value chains, you see many products no longer recognizable to the same extent as they once were as products of a particular country. They're more products of the world. And this was particularly associated with a period of globalization or hyper-globalization from the late 80s until roughly the second decade of the 21st century. And at the time, many proponents of neoliberalism identified trade liberalization as the unproblematic route for developing countries to integrate into global value chains. They said that this is where it is, that these global value chains are existing, and what developing countries should simply do is liberalize, and then what will happen is that you will integrate yourself into global value chains. But the real issue, as many critics argue, was not whether you were in or out of the value chain, but where you were located. Most developing countries, as I've already pointed out, are actually not out of global value chains, we're well into them, but we're in the least lucrative place as producers and exporters of raw materials. So next slide, please. So over time, a more developmental approach has emerged, which has begun to look at the opportunities of developing regional value chains as a basis of supporting deeper industrialization than can take place in individual countries. So I'm saying the African continental market is a $2 trillion plus market with 2.2 billion people. This is a market on a scale that could potentially support significant industrial transformation and diversification, and that this would contribute to greater inclusivity. Next slide, please. So now moving to what do we need to do to create regional value chains? They don't emerge automatically because we have a free trade area. They require actual construction. And I thought that this paper by Saul Levine and Neva Makhetla that was in a volume by UNCTAD, published by UNCTAD on regional value chains in SADC. And I think it summarizes the issue, to my mind anyway. The construction of regional value chains requires, quote, considerable capacity to identify appropriate measures and strengthen regional cooperation. Deepening regional specialization and exchange requires an institutional framework able to identify realistic projects, manage trade-offs between countries, and secure alignment around regulatory frameworks, trade facilitation, and infrastructure development and maintenance. So in other words, it identifies all of the developmental issues that are required to get a regional value chain in place. Regulatory frameworks, what is our regulatory framework going to be in the particular areas? How are we going to, first of all, ensure that we cooperate to deepen regional specialization and exchange, and then also how are we going to manage the trade-offs between the different countries that are potentially part of those regional value chains. Next slide, please. So I say that this is work which is now beginning with under the Secretariat, and these are some of the value chains that have been identified: agro-processing, pharmaceuticals and medical devices, clothing and textiles, automotive products, and a great acceptance of the idea of a regional value chain for green technologies. Now, I'm now moving to a little bit of a discussion about African industrialization. So Lopez and Tefelder, Carlos Lopez and his co-author, they argue that regional industrialization in general in Africa, African industrialization in general, has a historic opportunity to base itself on lower carbon technologies, and that some of the innovations that are around, like green hydrogen, are potentially significant. So they say we stand at a crossroad and we have an opportunity to base ourselves competitively on lower carbon technologies. This is across industry, across manufacturing, all parts of manufacturing. Another thing from the McKinsey group, they say that African manufacturing is responsible for 30 to 40% of the continent's greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know what the equivalent figure would be for the developed world, and will be adversely affected by the transition to a lower carbon economy unless they transform. I argue in the paper that I think that the McKinsey argument is focusing a little bit in the wrong way, because the issue is not that we have a huge stock of manufacturing industries in place, which is what I think the Lopez and Tefelder people are talking about. It's not that we have a huge amount of industries in place that we could lose. So we obviously need to recognize that we're going to have to be part of the transition there. but it's much more the Lopez and Tafelder argument that as we industrialize, we have an opportunity to root this in lower carbon technologies. Next slide, please. Now, I'm saying that while there is this necessity for manufacturing industry and the industrialization effort as a whole in all of the value chains, in all of the areas, to face that reality, there are also some initiatives underway at national level to support the manufacture of inputs into renewable energy, wind turbines, solar water heaters, photovoltaic equipment, CSP, and green hydrogen. All these there's inputs of one sort or another, either already being manufactured or seen as potentially being manufactured in different individual countries. But I looked in the literature and I couldn't find any known regional cooperation that is dealing with industrial issues. So most of the known regional cooperation projects, the one I came across, they talk about things other than the manufacturing of equipment. And yet, as I'm saying, Africa cannot afford to remain just a consumer of imported equipment and technology as an accelerated transition to the lower carbon economy unfolds. And just to underscore this, IRENA has calculated that providing sustainable and reliable energy to the continent will require a doubling of investment in energy from the current $30 billion which the continent invests in energy per annum to between $40 and $65 billion by 2030. And then on top of that, I'm saying that there's the imperative for climate proofing. Even if it's not carried out proactively, it will, post hoc command increasing attention as the world and the continent experience the inevitable extreme weather events. And this suggests that there's a significant market on the continent for the development of the types of green technology, particularly those suited for African conditions or drawing on its resource base, which would include hydropower or platinum catalyzed green hydrogen, and that these forms that are of clean energy that are more suited to African conditions or more suited to its resource base are more likely to be prioritized if there's a continental green ecosystem being developed than if the continent is just dependent on imports. Next slide, please. So this points to an opportunity, a desirability, and an imperative to work towards a specific green industries regional value chain. Next slide, please. So and now I'm going to just talk briefly about the other issues that are likely to emerge in COP27, and I think it's very important that we get a strong message across that Africa is one of the regions of the world, I think this is known, that will be most affected by climate change, even though we had the least role in creating it. The developed world must accept obligations in accordance with principles of common but differentiated obligations, and also the principle of polluter pays. Now, I know that the issue of loss and damage is going to loom large at COP27. A facility for this was supposed to have been in place by COP26, but the deadline was missed. And other forms of climate finance, both for mitigation and adaptation, are also likely to be a focus of delegations from the developing world, demands that there's a loss and damage facility, that there's climate finance, both for mitigation and adaptation. And I think that it's clear that all forms of climate finance, I would want to argue, need to be in the form of what we should be insisting on is real resource transfers and direct investments in building productive capacity. But because, and the next slide, is that I want to argue as well that my view, the next slide, the next slide, and the one after that. Yeah, that while a demand like this is undoubtedly just, we shouldn't have exaggerated expectations that it will materialize in the near future. As much of what has been offered by the developed world in climate finance packages announced in previous COPs is in my estimation, one, it's potential access to financialized products, discounted conditional loans denominated in foreign currency that could eventually add to the common continent's debt burden. So a large part of what the UK was offering as part of that deal that was offered to South Africa at COP26 is that the UK has a higher credit rating than South Africa. They would be prepared to borrow and on-lend to South Africa at a rate less than South Africa could do so directly because of our worse credit rating. So, and these loans will all be denominated in foreign currency. They'll all be subject to the conditions of those who are going to facilitate those loans. And the second source is access to private, so promises of support for access to private funding products, which, blended finance and things like that, which are dependent on offers of extensive guarantees, both against default and of a high premium rate of return. So I think that's what we're likely to get offered. We're not going to get a huge packets of unencumbered money and offered. And that's also partly because the Ukrainian reconstruction is seen as likely to divert many potential resources. The war already is doing that. So the slide that's already up, this is going to place a premium on advancing demands for structural transformation and industrial development. Industrializing off the shift to green energy and climate proofing on infrastructure will need the deployment of industrial policy tools, including devices like localization, tariff support for emerging industries, and we don't need free traded environmental goods, so-called free trade. That will be to the benefit of those who are already producing and are the manufacturers. They will just send their products to us. We need to ensure technology transfer is not impeded by exaggerated intellectual property regimes, and we need to take account of unilateral measures and private standards, which, although they are apparently motivated by a desire to promote an accelerated transition and meet net zero commitments, actually have enormous potential to be both unfair and to emerge as tools to exclude competitive imports from developing countries. So just here's the CBAMs, carbon border adjustment measures. The EU envisages them coming into force in 2026. They'll target products like cement and products produced using high carbon generated electricity. I can actually see what's going to happen. South Africa is competitive in citrus. We've already been facing issues of citrus black spot, all kinds of technical barriers to trade, which there's really no danger to human health. It's really not easy to pass it on through the peel, which is where you find microscopic traces of that. You can see that they turn around and say, well, your electricity used in the production of citrus is too high, and the effect of that will be that it won't be really to achieve net zero. It will be to keep us out to the benefit of European citrus producers who are less competitive. And you can see that kind of thing multiplied across all kinds of products. That could be the real danger, because we've already seen technical barriers to trade, the pesticide, food safety, chemical regulations imposed on the basis of debatable science, with a suspicion that the real motive is to limit the entry of competitive imports. So, and meeting these standards often requires large additional investments. Again, South African citrus, they had to spend something like R1 billion to meet EU standards on some of these pests. Next slide, please. So it's likely the EU will be followed by other developed countries. Unilateral measures is not in conformity with at least the spirit of WTO rules, but the disabling of the appellate body in the World Trade Organization through the actions of the previous US administration renders the chance of a successful challenge much less likely than it might have been earlier. And while probably not totally avoidable, setting of private standards by importers can have similar effects. So I think we need to be contesting these processes. That's what I'm arguing there. And so by way of conclusion, I think the challenge is, can we develop a green industries global value chain at regional economic community or continental level, preferably the latter? Can we defend our efforts against unfair trade measures that violate the principles of common but differentiated responsibility, as well as proposals for free trade in environmental goods that would undermine our policy space? Can we struggle for resource transfers from the rich world without conditionalities that will also undermine policy space? And hence, while Africa needs its own initiatives, it also needs to work, I think, for a developmental Green New Deal that's global in character in the climate change negotiations. So that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Thank you so much, Rob. I think you've raised a number of critical issues, but one thing that does stand out is that climate change, as we know, is disproportionately affecting African countries who are least responsible for climate change impacts, but we must at the same time recognize the opportunity that a low carbon pathway presents for our industries and industrialization ambitions, which fundamentally means better integration or alignment between, for example, clean energy programs and industrialization plans. I'd like to pick up on one point and maybe take a question from the chat box before bringing Faizel in. But my question is, what role do existing regional economic communities have to play in implementing the AfCFTA? How do you see the AfCFTA interfacing with existing RECs, all of which are at different levels of integration today? And then the second question, which is from the floor, is a question about how critical climate finance is in building green value chains. And perhaps you could respond to that question within the context of climate finance flows as we know it being considerably low to the continent by any measure. So those two questions in maybe just under a minute, if you can.
Yeah, and I thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think that the regional communities all still exist and they've all got their own programs. And so, and I think that most of what is identifiable as regional value chains in any sector on the African continent is located at the moment at REC level rather than across the RECs. So maybe we might need to start there. But I think that we haven't really moved to the sort of steps and processes that have been identified in the quote I took from Saul and Levine. Saul Levine and Neva Mkhetla, that quote. And I think that we need to move to do some of that work. And I think that's some of the work that we'll be discussing in the Advisory Council as well. On the question of finance, I think that the case for climate finance and for climate finance that is developmental in character is overwhelming. There were some interesting ideas in a seminar the other day from that was the Nelson Mandela School organized. The UNCTAD is proposing that the special drawing rights, that mechanism could be adapted with low conditionalities. But I think that the premium is really on the development finance institutions, our own development finance institutions. Building these up, I think that too much of this is smoke and mirrors. We can get debt denominated in foreign currency. It may be lower interest rate, but if our exchange rates change, that debt could be extremely expensive. And although it may not be initially at high conditionalities, if we default on it or we can't pay it back and we have to go and renegotiate, then the conditionalities will certainly step in and they'll be very, very onerous conditionalities. And some of those conditionalities will probably be no localization on green technologies, and that would be a disaster for efforts to try to industrialize off this transition.
Thanks, Rob. Faizel, I'll hand over to you for the next couple of minutes, and then we can maybe get into more questions and a discussion.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Maria, for this opportunity. And well, firstly, Rob has really been highly comprehensive. He's covered a a wide range of issues, and so I don't really need to repeat the points he's made. So I'm going to just make 5 points to make a case for how Africa should respond to the emerging trends that Rob has highlighted. So my first point is, I think I agree entirely with Rob that there is a new emerging trend in the world economy, and that is one of a decisive shift to low carbon. And this is both a trend that is emerging from pressures in the global multilateral system, and is clearly an imperative for countries in the world to ensure that we move towards net zero, and we avoid the catastrophe that the IPCC has indicated we would be in if we continue with the current path of economic development. So what this suggests is that the new basis of competition in the world is going to be based on low carbon technologies. And what we can see already is a shift in this direction by the major economies in the north and some in the south, like China. But clearly the Green New Deal that the EU has initiated, and the more recently, I haven't seen a lot of detail about this, but I can see in the US, the new Inflation Reduction bill that they're passing to Congress has hundreds of billions of dollars going into green infrastructure technology and subsidies for their producers and exporters in this area. So what we can see emerging is if you like, maybe exaggerating, but a fifth industrial revolution. So if the fourth industrial revolution is based on the new technologies in AI and the Internet of Things, the fifth is surely emerging in the low carbon technologies or the green economy space. Now, my second point is that unfortunately, the new global trend that has emerged over the last decades in the creation of global value chains, where countries in the north have outsourced and offshored lower value added production, has tended to create a pattern of production where the high intensive carbon production is taking place in the south, in developing countries. So the sort of dirty production, if you like, in steel, aluminium, cement, and all these type of products take place mostly in the south. So putting immediately the developing countries at a disadvantage in a new emerging global low carbon economy. So my third point is that what we see is that interestingly for developing countries and Africa is that some of the new commodities that are essential for the new competitiveness in low carbon economies are in Africa and in other developing countries, like some of those that Rob has mentioned, like lithium ion or hydrogen and platinum. And but what we immediately see as an emerging trend is that investors in the north are investing in various ways and locking in developing countries into the old patterns, north-south patterns of commodity dependence extraction, where the value chain of production will be one where the new technologies to process those commodities into high value added technologies will be in the north, and the commodity extractions will be taking place in the south. So there is a really, I think, an emerging trend of the re-emergence of the same commodity dependence, high value added in the north and low value added in the south, relationship that suggests itself if developing countries don't work hard to transform this relationship. The fourth point I want to make is that the current rules of the system, the rules of the game in the WTO and in other parts of the multilateral system are continue to be asymmetrical, favoring the North and being unfair and unequal to developing countries. So for over 60 years, we've had a situation where the rules of the WTO supported the exports of manufacturers from developed countries to the South and obstructed the export of agricultural goods and textiles from the South to the North through a range of protective barriers and unfair rules in the trading system. So the question that emerges is, are we going to see a similar asymmetry of the rules-based system that is going to emerge to address the new competition in the green economy or green industrialization that is emerging in the WTO and the rules-based system more generally, once again, in favor of the North? Are we going to see the same asymmetry? What we have seen already is that although the WTO from its existence promised in its preamble to support sustainable development, we have not seen a positive contribution by developed countries in the way in which they have negotiated or behaved in the WTO negotiations on issues related to sustainable development. So if you take, for example, the negotiations on environmental goods and services in the WTO, which has been going on for almost 20 years, that negotiation came to an impasse because northern countries put on the list a large number of goods where they were competitive and which had very little to do with environmental standards or environmental protection. And this, suggests that, a mercantilist approach to negotiations and a disregard really for the preambular commitment of the WTO to sustainability. Now, what is re-emerging in the WTO? Across the WTO, there are a raft of rules that impact on environmental, on the environment, on climate change, potentially, and these include everything from the agreement on agriculture to government procurement to subsidies and countervailing duties to non-tariff barriers, intellectual property rights. So across all these areas, there's a discourse taking place in the WTO now about how to make these rules more consistent or supportive of environmental protection. And what has happened is some of the major economies have gone into a sort of a plurilateral mode in the WTO, which they call structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. This is what they, in the WTO language, they call the JSIs, joint statement initiatives, or in other words, they are plurilaterals. There are groups of countries coming together, led mostly by northern countries, to discuss issues where they can't get consensus multilaterally, or where there is a resistance by the majority of developing countries to participate because they see these as being imposed in an unfair way, or the potential for these discussions to perpetuate the same asymmetry of the current rules-based system. Now, in these discussions, in this JSI on structured or so-called structured discussion on trade and environmental sustainability, there are proposals being made for a whole-scale reform of the WTO across the board, across a whole range of rules towards making these rules more consistent with the new competition on low carbon, on the protection of the environment, and other issues that relate to climate change. Now, the question for developing countries and for Africa is, how should Africa engage in this discussion more generally and in the WTO? I have argued that, well, in this draft paper that I'm writing, that when you consider the discussion taking place in the UNFCCC and the issues that have emerged for developing countries, what we see is that there is a lot of pressure on developing countries to make commitments in their nationally determined contributions on mitigation, so to reduce carbon. But there's very little support for adaptation, which is really the main area where developing countries are impacted in a range of issues, from agriculture to infrastructure. Countries have to adapt because already climate change is having a huge impact on and devastating impact on African countries, and on resilience, how to strengthen the capacity of the infrastructure and industries in developing countries and in Africa to sustain itself, to strengthen itself against the hazards of climate change. So very little attention is being paid to those issues. And so it seems to me that the first responsibility and the task of African countries is to develop their own strategies, what I call climate resilient development strategies, integrating into their own development strategies the need to combat the risks of emerging from climate change, to do this across the board in industrialization, and I think Rob has talked about that, how to ensure that we begin to move towards low carbon, and to address the key issue of energy infrastructure, and to make the shift towards renewable energy, and to, in the case of those countries like ours, which are heavily invested in coal or fossil fuels, how to transition, but in a way which is just and inclusive, and at the same time, how to address adaptation issues in agriculture, which is the mainstay for most African countries, and then to build and strengthen resilience, especially in infrastructure. So this is a challenge for African countries. We have to do this, and we have to integrate this into our national development strategies. Now, the big opportunity for Africa is that we are embarking upon a very ambitious regional integration project. And so the challenge, it seems to me, for Africa and the AfCFTA is how to integrate climate resilient development into its regional strategies. And I've argued for a developmental regionalism approach. And so I suppose I should be arguing now for a climate resilient developmental regionalism. So integrating climate resilient development into development strategies of the AfCFTA. Exactly how that could happen and how that must happen will depend very much on, you know, a discussion about the development strategies that Africa would need to adopt in each of these core areas, like energy, industrialization, agriculture, how to develop its finance institutions, and how it engages on trade issues, both intra-regional trade, but also with its trading partners across the world. So it would seem to me that once Africa is able to address this question, it can then consider how in the rules that it negotiates amongst African countries, whether those rules are about subsidies in fossil fuels or in subsidies for agriculture or intellectual property rights. So on all these issues that are already on the table that Africa, the AfCFTA is considering, it'll have to integrate climate resilient development. And it seems to me that that would be the basis on which to engage in the WTO. And to engage in the WTO on how best to reform the rules of the WTO to address the new world that we're living in, the new competition in the world, but in a manner which is more equitable, which is more inclusive, and which is more just. So I'll stop there, and we can then answer questions that come. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Faizel. Yeah, I think you touched on some really important systemic issues in the global economic order, whether it relates to technology transfer and trading rules set within the WTO framework and the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism that Rob also touched on, and what that could potentially mean for greening industrial value chains or building value chains. There's a question in the chat on electric vehicles specifically, and how it links to cobalt and lithium that's mostly mined in the DRC and Zimbabwe. They are exported to China and Africa with very low intra-regional trade. So the question is, how can AfCFTA counter or enhance the EV global value chain, given the exaggerated intellectual property of the policies of the EU? I'm not sure who would like to take that question.
Okay, I haven't seen the question, but from what you say, well, I think the issue of intellectual property is a very significant one. So, you'll recall that at the moment, the big debate in Geneva was about a waiver for developing countries, especially who want to access generic medicines, or who want to be able to access medicines without the impediments of and the strictures of intellectual property rights, which raise the price of these medicines. So similarly, there is a discussion about how, in the case of climate change and the new technologies that are emerging, like electric vehicles, to address issues of climate change or the shift towards a low carbon future and an economy, how these new technologies can be shared, and so that we don't get into the similar problem that we have of raising the price of these technologies and making them inaccessible to developing countries. So you repeat the pattern of high technology products and high value added being produced in the north, and developing countries simply being the importers of these technologies, and then being locked into this very dependent relationship with the North. So I think that this has to be a discussion in the WTO. There has been, as I said, there was this preamble in the WTO about a commitment, but there are many other areas where there's even a working group in the WTO on technology transfer, and no progress has been made on that for about 30 years. Since the creation of the WTO. And so we need to discuss intellectual property rights, again, in the context of climate change, and how to revise the rules, reform the rules of the WTO, so that the new technologies, which are, should be made public goods, so that they are accessible and more affordable, and developing countries too will have the opportunity to produce these, and industrialize. Thank you.
Thanks, Faizel. Rob, perhaps you could take this one. It's a combined comment and question, but it reads that the imperative for low carbon industrialization is clear, and African countries have no choice but to move in that direction. The challenge is that as latecomers, African countries need to accelerate industrialization through RBCs, which requires, amongst other things, intensive use of resources and massive investment in infrastructure, which can be carbon intensive activity, especially the development of hard infrastructure. So the question is, how do we reconcile these potentially conflicting objectives, given in particular the undercapitalization of African regional financial institutions and the reluctance of development partners to meet the commitments they made on finance? Do we think that the time has come for African countries to give up on developing countries' commitments to the special and differential treatment principles and start to develop their own strategy building on the AfCFTA agenda? It's a long-winded question, but please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I do think the last point that you made, if we are to base our development strategies on expectations as to what's going to be delivered from the developed world, I think we're going to be disappointed. So I think we need to develop our own strategies, and the basis of those engage more actively with the developed world. And I think that what I wanted to say was that if we are merely inserted again in the lower carbon economy, in the production of the raw materials, the mining of all of those minerals that are needed in lower carbon products, that mining itself is not going to be very environmentally sustainable unless there's interventions of various sorts. We could find ourselves just once again being the dirt boxes of the world as the world transitions. So I think that merely getting involved in that mining activity is not enough. So I think that the climate, I mean, Faizel's right. I mean, the adaptation is really where I think Africa needs to put up a huge amount of effort in place, because we are being affected already, and we are going to be more and more affected as time goes on, and that's going to require a fairly significant infrastructure investment. But that infrastructure investment, as is any case, we need to undergo that infrastructure investment. That infrastructure investment needs to support local manufacturing. If we support local manufacturing, at least we reduce also some of the carbon involved in the transport over long distances of equipment that can easily be manufactured much closer to source. So I think that the issue is that the imperative is clearly there. I think I was focusing also on particularly the energy issue. And if we're going to go through a fairly sizable investment in energy, then let's make sure we get the manufacturing benefits off that. I just wanted to say one thing of the vehicles. First of all, I think that the consensus up to now is that the hydrogen fuel cell is probably at this stage best adapted for larger vehicles, public transport vehicles, buses, underground mining vehicles, that kind of stuff. And I think we really need to seize this opportunity quite quickly, because it's there. And some of this work has already happened in South Africa. Platinum as a catalyst is adding value or beneficiating a mineral resource that some of us have. And the electric vehicle issue is at the moment we don't produce them on the continent. None of the continent's vehicle manufacturers produce electric vehicles. We hardly use electric vehicles for that matter. And I think that there is an effort going on, I know, at least in South Africa, to try to ensure that manufacturers are actually transitioning to electric vehicles. There is a downside of that, and that is that something like 40% of, 4 times as many jobs are created per unit of investment in component manufacturing than in assembly. But you need the assembly to get the components. But electric vehicles use many, many less components, so that it will not be as job intensive, at least on the current trajectories that we have available to us now.
Thanks, Rob. There's a comment in the chat on EVs, and just pointing out the fact that the biggest challenge with lithium-ion value chains is not so much IP, but the fact that mid and downstream processing happens outside of the continent and mostly in China. And this is linked to the fact that there's no processing capacity in Africa. So this could be an area where we could develop regional value chains. Faizel, you mentioned agriculture, and Rob also just alluded to the importance of adaptation. And there's a question on whether you could give us insight into how adaptation for Africa's food system is being raised in AfCFTA discussions.
Right. Well, I don't think at this stage there's a big discussion in the African continental free trade area about adaptation. I think that, at this stage, the AfCFTA is focused on completing the negotiations on the reduction of tariffs and the rules of origin. And the sort of phase 2 rules are discussing issues of intellectual property rights, investment and competition, but it's at a very early stage. So to be quite frank, I don't think at this point African countries have really begun to engage on how, at least in the regional integration negotiations, how to include climate change and how to introduce rules on climate change in the AfCFTA. It is a very new subject for discussion. So I myself am just thinking about it and applying my mind to it as we've been preparing for this webinar, and in the paper that I've been writing, really reflecting on how would we on the continent, how would we want to structure our relationships with each other so that our relationships are collaborative, they are mutually beneficial, and they do address the core questions of climate change and how Africa should best transition to low carbon, also how it adapts, how it builds its infrastructure in a more resilient way. How could it do all of this in a way which creates rules which are fair and just? So that's the question, and we don't know the answer to that. So we have to debate it. We have to have discussions like this, and I think that this is the best sort of laboratory really for Africa to build its own vision, its own values, its own norms that it could use to then negotiate multilaterally. So its vision of the world and how the world rules should look like, it should engage with each other and formulate those rules here.
Thanks, Faizel. Just one last question, I think, before we close this webinar, and it relates to the JETP. It says, looking at the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa and similar platforms being set up in other African nations, what role will the AfCFTA play as the value chains for new green industries relating to the transition of energy system grow in these countries? I guess the question is around, is there a role for AfCFTA in relation to the JETP country platform discussions, especially if we're talking of renewable energy and the energy transition?
Yeah, so the big issue on the continent is how to build Africa's energy infrastructure, because as we know, in most parts of the continent, there is no, or there's very little energy infrastructure, and you know, in some countries, the average is below 50%, and in some countries, access is as low as 10, 11%. So the real challenge is building energy infrastructure, because as you know, we need infrastructure for almost everything. We need it for industrialization, we need it for consumption, we need it for social purposes, cooking, in households. So energy is a vital infrastructure, and we need to build this infrastructure in the most efficient way, but now we need to make sure that we do it in a manner which causes the least damage to the environment. What is, in our view, a big opportunity for Africa is that renewable energy has become much, much cheaper than it used to be. And so for those countries that are just starting off, it's much cheaper for them, it's more efficient, the technologies are becoming more available to use renewable energies like solar and wind, geothermal energy, to build their energy infrastructure. So this is where African countries can cooperate. So we had a webinar, the Nelson Mandela School, a few weeks ago, focusing on this question, how Africa can cooperate on the renewable energy technologies, and also how Africa can build and
Thank you, Faizel. I think there's a lot to unpack, and this is the beginning of many conversations to come on this topic, including from the Nelson Mandela School. But I do think we've come to the end of this webinar, and thank you all for your participation, and a special thanks to our speakers, Rob Davies and Faizel Ismail. Thank you for really just shedding light on how aspects of the continent's economic integration agenda under the AfCFTA can support structural transformation, and also highlighting some of the big challenges we can anticipate in trying to build more resilient economies. Please do look out for our soon to be published expert briefs on the ACF's website, as well as Faizel's forthcoming paper on trade and climate resilient development. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Rob.